just after sunrise off the coast of Curaçao, 3 small warships turned a routine U.S. Navy transit into a high-speed game of chicken. They were Venezuelan patrol boats, pushing a little over 20 knots toward a U.S. carrier strike group in international waters, spreading out across the bow to build a moving steel wall no captain could ignore. The video calls it 28 knots, which is a stretch compared to their real specs, and that gap makes the charge look less like a calm intercept and more like a risky push to force the Americans to flinch. On the U.S. side, the destroyer USS Gravely slammed its turbines to full and cut ahead of the carrier, turning itself into a gray shield between the patrol line and a multi-billion-dollar strike group. Its 127mm gun swung toward the threat, CIWS spun up into ready state, and an MH-60R Seahawk clawed into the sky with cameras hot and weapons cold, ordered to film everything but not fire first. From that moment on, every knot of speed and every degree of heading carried more political weight than any missile. And the real question became, who would break formation first? So stay with military force as this encounter is broken down second by second. The first clear picture of the confrontation came when 3 Venezuelan patrol ships pushed up their throttles and drove across the sea at just over 20 knots toward a U.S. carrier strike group off Curaçao, spreading their bows into a rough line directly in front of the American formation. On paper, these vessels belong to families like the Guaycamacudo and Guaycari classes, which usually top out around 20 to 24 knots. So the video claim of 28 knots sounds more like a dramatic headline than a tested figure. Yet the speed they actually reached was still enough to close distance fast and turn a routine transit into a live test of resolve. From the American side, the formation looked simple but dangerous, because the carrier USS George Washington held the center of the group while a ring of escorts guarded its flanks, and the 3 incoming hulls were driving to a place where any collision or sudden turn would send a political message as loud as any gunshot. The first combatant to move was not the carrier itself, but the escort destroyer USS Gravely, an Arleigh Burke-class ship built around the Aegis combat system with SM-2 and ESSM missiles and a close-in defense grid. And that hull was designed to step forward whenever a threat approached the heart of the group. Gravely's turbines surged toward high power as the ship swung out of its escort lane and cut diagonally across the path of the carrier, placing its own gray bow between the Venezuelan line and the strike group, which is exactly how U.S. Navy doctrine trains an escort to act when someone tries to block the route. Once that shield was in motion, the 127mm Mark 45 gun on the forward deck rotated a few degrees toward the patrol craft, not in a fast snap that would signal immediate fire, but in a slow and clear movement that told anyone watching through binoculars that the weapon crew was fully awake. Farther aft, the Phalanx close-in weapon system spun up through its checks, barrel cluster turning at idle speed and internal electronics warming. And this hum of machinery showed that the last defensive line for the ship could move from standby to engagement in seconds if a missile or shell ever left a Venezuelan rail. Above the water, flight deck crews rushed an MH-60R Seahawk into position, pulled safety pins, unfolded rotor blades, and sent the helicopter climbing to a few hundred feet, where its electro-optical and infrared sensors could paint a detailed picture of every wake, hull shape, and launcher on the patrol boats. The helicopter team received strict instructions to keep every weapon safe and every targeting system cold, because their mission in that moment was not to lead a strike, but to record angles, distances, and bearings, giving commanders proof of intent while denying Caracas any excuse to claim that American forces fired first. From the carrier deck, the whole scene looked like a narrow gray spear moving out to meet a thin wall of steel, with one destroyer taking the physical risk so that the larger ship behind it could stay on its planned track and maintain the legal claim that it was simply passing through international waters under long-standing navigation rights. While engines thundered and hardware turned in full view on the surface and in the air, the real control of this encounter began to shift away from the open decks toward the dim, crowded space where radar tracks and voice reports are fused into decisions. And that space was the Combat Information Center deep inside USS Gravely. Inside the Combat Information Center of USS Gravely, the confrontation did not look like a dramatic video clip. It looked like 3 clean radar echoes sliding across a grid. Each contact showed a steady bearing, a closing range dropping from around 12 nautical miles to single digits, and a speed line that matched a fast patrol profile on the surface plot. When those symbols began to spread into a horizontal line in front of the carrier's projected track, the geometry told a simple story, because a loose escort would shadow alongside, while this pattern was shaping a barrier. So inside that dim room, where operators speak in numbers more than adjectives, the picture already pointed to a deliberate attempt to stand in the way, rather than a routine trail. That picture grew sharper as the surface watch officer read out bearing, range, and speed in a steady voice, while the tactical action officer updated the common tactical display with fresh marks. On the console, 3 Venezuelan hulls were tagged with symbology that flagged them as a potential blockade posture, lined up across the route of the U.S. formation instead of sitting off to one flank. The team watched the closest point of approach calculations tighten and time to that point count down in minutes. So the question was no longer if an interaction would happen, but how controlled it would be. In that situation, numbers on a screen had to turn very quickly into clear-spoken words on a radio circuit. The first American response followed a script that had been tested in many other tense passages, because the United States uses standard language whenever its ships feel squeezed at sea. A calm voice went out on an open maritime channel, identifying the transmitter as a United States warship, stating that it was operating lawfully in international waters, and noting that the group was in a restricted formation for safety. The message asked the Venezuelan vessels to alter course and maintain safe separation, and the tone stayed professional, since any trace of anger on the radio can be replayed later as fuel for claims of reckless behavior. This was more than etiquette, as every word in that call had been crafted over years to sit inside the frame of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Naming UNCLOS in such a moment was not a random legal flourish, because Washington has long used that treaty as the backbone for its navigation rights, even when other capitals dispute how far those rights go. U.S. destroyers like USS Nitsa and USS Detroit had already sailed close to Venezuela in earlier freedom of navigation operations, challenging what Washington saw as excessive maritime claims in the Caribbean basin. Radio discipline therefore became one more tool in a larger contest over maps and rules, not just a way to keep steel from scraping steel. Yet while American officers leaned on treaty language and phrases like international waters, the Venezuelan side answered with a different vocabulary built around security and revolution, and that choice of words would define the next phase of this standoff. The turning point in the exchange came when the Venezuelan ships replied on the radio and declared the waters ahead to be a Bolivarian security zone, because that phrase turned a simple navigation warning into a political claim over the sea itself. They did not just ask the American formation to be careful. They told the U.S. carrier group to reduce speed and change course. And by doing that, they implied that this stretch of ocean was part of a special security belt where Caracas could set its own rules. For crews on Gravely and the carrier, the message sounded like an attempt to rename international waters as a national shield, so the words on the radio carried as much weight as the hulls on the horizon. That is important, because once language on the air starts to redraw lines on the map, every move in the standoff becomes part of a larger argument about who controls which piece of blue water. The phrase Bolivarian security zone did not appear out of nowhere, since Venezuelan leaders have used the Bolivarian label for years to wrap legal disputes in revolutionary language. Caracas often accuses Washington of intruding into its exclusive economic zone or threatening offshore resources, even though Venezuela has not fully locked itself into the same convention that U.S. lawyers like to cite. By calling the area a special protection belt linked to the Bolivarian project, officials at home can claim they are defending a political legacy not just an abstract line on a chart. So when that wording came back over the radio during this approach, it fit a pattern in which maritime law, national pride, and ideology are blended into one message aimed at both foreign navies and domestic audiences. On the tactical side, the Venezuelan crews also shifted their behavior to match their new language because their radar picture and formation began to look more like a barrier than a shadow. Surface search sets swept the water ahead while the three hulls held a line almost perpendicular to the U.S. track, and this geometry signaled that they wanted to stand in the way without actually firing. What did not appear in the electronic spectrum was just as telling, since there were no signs of dedicated fire control radar locking onto Gravely. No sharp spikes that would have meant a weapon system was being cued. From a professional point of view, this combination of a firm line on the surface and a softer posture in the beam suggested that the aim was pressure and symbolism, not an immediate jump to combat. The American side mirrored that careful balance because U.S. doctrine in such close calls is to show that the fleet is ready while still leaving a visible gap before any trigger is pulled. On deck, the main gun remained trained in a general direction without a high elevation that screams imminent use. The phalanx mounts hummed at idle, and the Seahawk stayed in its orbit with sensors active and weapons untouched. This posture let American commanders signal that the group had plenty of firepower in reserve while still keeping the legal and moral high ground in case anything went wrong. Behind the scenes, every technical detail of the encounter was being stored, because the U.S. Navy treats these episodes as much as evidence as it does as risk. By building this archive in real time, the ship's company was not only protecting itself in the court of public opinion, it was also preparing for the moment when political language on the radio would collide with hard facts from the sensors, and that clash would come into focus in the most intense phase of the standoff. The crisis point of the encounter came when the range collapsed to just a few nautical miles, and neither side showed any sign of giving way. At that stage, the Venezuelan patrol ships held a hard line across the projected track, while the American carrier group stayed locked on a heading of about 217 degrees at roughly 20 knots, with no change in course or speed. The destroyer shifted fully into the role of spear point for the American side, with its bow aimed directly at the small gap between the Venezuelan hulls, and that alignment said more than any phrase on the radio. If the patrol line kept closing, the destroyer would be the first ship to meet them and would absorb the impact instead of the carrier behind it. And that is exactly how escort doctrine is designed to protect a high-value unit. From the perspective of the crews on both sides, a single mistake in speed or helm order could turn that spearhead into a ramming incident. So this was not just a show of posture, it was a calculated bet that the barrier would blink. Officers who had studied that file would have seen the same risk factors appear again in this new standoff, which made every knot of speed toward the closing point feel heavier than a simple navigation choice. While steel edged closer on the surface, the air picture added its own layer of pressure. The MH-60R Seahawk stayed at a low to medium altitude, working a wide circle with the sun at its back so that the Venezuelan crews could see its outline but not ignore it. Its infrared camera picked up the shape of missile canisters and gun mounts on the patrol decks, feeding a steady stream of imagery down to the destroyer. Yet the pilots still held to a strict no overflight rule that kept them from crossing directly over the lead ship. By staying just outside the most provocative flight paths, the helicopter reminded both sides that every weapon was mapped, every launcher was known, and every move could be replayed later without tipping into a pattern that looked like a strike. At the same time, the carrier itself kept a powerful silence that carried its own message. Catapults were powered and ready but did not launch fighters. Deck crews stayed at their stations, and aircraft remained secured instead of roaring skyward, which signaled that the group had air power in reserve but was not willing to escalate first. This stance said that restraint, discipline, and a steady wake were the main tools chosen for this clash, even though the ship carried enough aviation strength to change the balance in minutes if an order came. Taken together, a destroyer aimed like a spear, a patrol line refusing to step aside, a helicopter circling with cameras live, and a carrier holding its nerves created a narrow window where any sudden turn could have set off a disaster. And that window would finally close only when one side eased off the throttle and accepted a different course. The standoff finally began to cool when the Venezuelan patrol ships eased off their throttles and let the distance grow. On the American side, there was no matching show of retreat, because the carrier group held its chosen line exactly as its commanders had promised on the radio. The big deck stayed on its original heading and speed, while USS Gravely made only small course corrections to slip back into a classic escort slot, rather than stand as a spear in the gap. Overhead, the MH-60R Seahawk kept orbiting while the range opened towards 6 nautical miles and beyond, maintaining a clear sensor picture until the tactical team judged that any sudden turn by the patrol boats would no longer pose a direct hazard. Only when that buffer was secure did the helicopter crew receive permission to return to the ship, and that timeline underlined the message that the group would keep watching until the last doubt about safety had been removed. Behind the scenes, every second of this slow separation was treated as material for the record, not just as a moment of relief for sailors on watch. Radar sweeps were stored with exact timestamps. Bearing lines were captured as they swung from blocking geometry into a parallel pattern, and the full audio from the radio exchanges was saved alongside infrared footage from the Seahawk's sensors. Taken together, those files can show precisely who held steady, who altered course, and how close the hulls came at each point in time, which matters greatly when governments later argue about what really happened at sea. For the U.S. Navy, turning a stressful encounter into a structured case file is part of how it proves that its crews followed navigation rules, avoided firing first, and still refused to surrender control of a lawful route. In strategic language, this episode is a textbook example of what officers call deterrence through presence, because the U.S. force relied on its steady wake and visible readiness rather than missiles or gunfire to send a message. A carrier strike group continued along a recognized sea lane while a smaller navy eventually peeled away, and that outcome told anyone watching that declared security zones cannot automatically rewrite the rules for international waters. Washington has poured thousands of troops, numerous surface combatants, and even another carrier like USS Gerald R. Ford into the region under the banner of major counter-narcotics and stability efforts, while critics say those deployments also raise pressure on President Maduro's government. Caracas has answered with large coastal defense drills, high-profile mobilizations, and appeals to friendly states in the Bolivarian camp to back its stance against what it calls foreign interference, so every close pass at sea becomes another signal in that wider contest. This makes a single near collision between patrol boats and a carrier group less about one morning off Curaçao, and more about how far each side is willing to go in testing red lines without letting a limited crisis explode into a regional clash. For viewers who follow weapons, strategy, and politics, the final lesson is that movements measured in knots and nautical miles can reveal deep shifts in power and intent. And those shifts set the stage for any serious conclusion about where the Caribbean balance is heading. On the surface, this looked like a short, tense morning in the Caribbean that ended quietly, with no shots and no collision. At a deeper level, it was a live test between a Bolivarian security zone, claimed from Caracas, and the freedom of navigation stance defended by Washington. The fact that Venezuelan patrol ships finally slowed, turned, and slid away while the U.S. carrier group held course showed how discipline, training, and calm nerves can turn political will into real leverage at sea. U.S. crews kept weapons cold, followed safety rules, and refused to yield a legal route, and that combination sent a stronger signal than any press conference. In 2025, this matters even more, because the Caribbean is filled with American warships, counter-narcotics raids, allied concerns, Venezuelan mobilizations, and rival powers watching for weakness. Each close pass without gunfire becomes a quiet stress test of how far both sides will go to protect influence without triggering a wider clash. For viewers who study weapons and politics, the real question now is how long deterrence through presence can hold the line before someone decides that posture is not enough. If you want clear, straight talk on these standoffs, the hardware behind them, and the geopolitics shaping the next one, stay with Military Force, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next breakdown.